Hey there, welcome. Thanks for being here. In this video, we're going to talk about hamstring training, what to focus on, what not to focus on, and everything in between. Specifically, we'll focus on what the hamstrings actually do, what muscles make up the group of muscles that are the hamstrings, what exercises there are to target the respective movements and muscles that are pertinent, and then we'll talk about some programming considerations specific to the hamstrings. So the hamstrings are a group of muscles that cross both the hip and the knee joint. As a result, they are responsible for two different movements, both knee flexion and hip extension. So knee flexion is just the idea of your heel getting closer to your butt, so any kind of leg curl action. And hip extension is the idea of your knee going farther back behind your body. Caveat is that the hamstrings really only contribute to hip extension when your knee is more straight, or at least the more straight your knee is, the more the hamstrings will contribute to this movement. The reason being is, again, the hamstrings are a two-joint muscle, so when you bend your knee, the hamstrings are shortened. And when your knee is bent during hip extension, they're shortened to a point where they really aren't in a position where they can meaningfully help the movement, whereas when they're extended, it's a bit more advantageous for them. And this can very easily be seen in practice. So if you were to compare a stiff leg deadlift to a hip thrust, you would feel the stiff leg deadlift much more in the hamstrings compared to the hip thrust. And again, that's because the hip thrust, your knees are bent during that movement, where the stiff leg deadlift, your knees are more straight. So that's the movements of the hamstrings. So let's talk about the muscles that make up this group of muscles. And there's a very specific reason why I bring this up that I'll talk about at the end of the slide. So the term hamstrings refers to the group of muscles that includes the semitendinosus, semimembranosus, the short head and long head of the biceps femoris, and the adductor magnus, or at least part of it. Now, the reason that I bring up this slide is not necessarily for you to memorize all these muscles, because I don't think that'd be worth your time, but rather to illustrate the point that the muscles listed here either contribute to both hip extension or knee flexion, or they contribute to one or the other. So the semitendinosus, semimembranosus, and the long head of the biceps femoris are always going to contribute to both hip extension and knee flexion. The short head of the biceps femoris is only going to contribute to knee flexion, and that's because it does not cross the hip joint, so it can't really do anything there. And the adductor magnus, at least the hamstring part of it, is only going to contribute to hip extension exercises because it does not cross the knee joint, so it can't do anything there. So the relevant take home here is that in order to sufficiently train and maximally develop all of your hamstrings, you need at least one type of hip extension exercise and one type of knee flexion exercise. If you were to only do hip extension type of exercises like stiff leg deadlifts, then the short head of the biceps femoris would go relatively untrained. Likewise, if you were to only do leg curl type exercises, then the adductor magnus, the hamstring part, would go, relatively untrained. So it is worthwhile to have at least one type of exercise of each form in your routine. So in regard to knee flexion based exercises, there are three that I program most commonly, and they are the ones listed here. So seated leg curls, lying leg curls, and sliding leg curls. The difference between a seated and a lying leg curl is how bent your hips are during the movement. So because your hips are more bent during a seated leg curl, because you're seated, you're sitting down, the hamstrings will be more stretched throughout the entire range of motion, whereas they'll be in a much more shortened position in the lying leg curls. There is some good evidence to show that the extra stretch you get from seated leg curls will build more muscle than the lying leg curls, as in there's a study that compares them directly, and the group that did the seated leg curls built more muscle on a volume equated basis compared to those doing lying leg curls. I do have another article and I think video explaining that study in a bit more detail if you're interested. But nevertheless, seated leg curls, if you had to pick one, probably would be your better pick. However, lying leg curls, there is an advantage to doing them over time. And so for instance, in most of the long muscle length type training studies out there does seem to be some degree of regional hypertrophy insofar that, if you train a muscle in a much more lengthened position, there does seem to be more muscle built on one side of the muscle as opposed to the other, for lack of a better term. So it's not unreasonable to spend a good amount of time, or some amount of time at least, doing lying leg curls to kind of, counteract that. But most of your time should be doing seated leg curls if these are available to you. Now, also, I didn't mention it, but I have demo videos for all these that I will put in the description box below. The point of this video isn't necessarily to kind of go over technique for all these things, but more to explain the rationale for why you would do one or the other. Sliding leg curls are a little bit unique insofar that they are predominantly a knee flexion exercise, but they are going to involve some hip extension. So if you don't know, a sliding leg curl, different names for it, but I just call them sliding leg curls, are where your heel, you're laying on your back, and your heels are on some sort of sliding type surface. It could be something with wheels, a towel on a tile surface, anything similar. And you lift your hips off the ground in that position, and then you bring your heels to your butt and away from your butt in a leg curl type of fashion. So what makes them unique is that they really, in a way, combine knee flexion and hip extension. So if you had to pick one hamstring exercise that you were going to do for the rest of your life and you couldn't do any more, this wouldn't be a bad pick. There also could be an argument to say that, sliding leg curls are a bit more specific to what your hamstrings would have to do during things like running, sprinting, etc. And it wouldn't be unreasonable to say that they might prepare your hamstrings better for this type of exercise or for that type of movement than seated or lying leg curls. I don't believe there's any evidence, really showing that. So you can call that sort of speculation just based on the principle of specificity, but it is something that I will program for clients every now and then, for that sort of purpose. Or conversely, if you're training in a home gym and you don't have access to a machine leg curl, whether it's seated or lying, then sliding leg curls are going to be your best bet as far as a knee flexion type of exercise. So as far as hip extension exercises go, these are really, for the hamstring specifically, I should say, these are the movements that I will tend to program the most for clients. So a stiff leg or Romanian deadlift. Really, the only real difference is that an RDL is going to have a bit more of a bent knee than an SLDL. I think it's semantics, honestly, to differentiate between them. And I think the results you see long term, if you use an SLDL specific technique or an RDL specific technique, is going to be pretty much the same. A 45-degree hyperextension is just that device that's kind of like that. And you do hip extension on there with your knees straight because it forces them to be straight. And then a GHD is a hip extension where your body is like this as opposed to like that. And again, demo videos I will link all down below for your reference. Not all gyms have these, but more seem to be having them these days. And here really the difference is, again, how stretched your hamstrings are during the exercise. So something like an SLDL or an RDL, those are going to have the most of a stretch emphasis because most of the tension of the movement is going to felt when you're mostly bent over or when your hamstrings are mostly bent. Or in other words, when your hips are at about a 90-degree angle or so is when you will feel the most tension on those type of exercises. On a 45-degree extension, you'll feel the most tension in your hamstrings when your hips are at about 135 degrees. So kind of midway. And then on a GHD, you'll feel the most tension in your hamstrings when your hips are at about 180 degrees. So when you're perfectly straight at the hips. And again, there does seem to be something special about training a muscle in its lengthened position or a more stretched position, in other words. So you could say these are listed in order from best to worst, but it is good to kind of incorporate, all three over time if available to you in order to build proficiency at each respective range of motion. So now let's talk about programming. So in terms of volume of hamstring training that you do, my recommendation would be the same as for any other muscle group. And I have a whole other article on volume that I'll link down below because it'll give you a much better explainer there. But basically the main point that I want to illustrate here is that you shouldn't track, volume of knee flexion exercises or volume of hip extension exercises. Just track volume of hamstring exercises altogether. That's perfectly fine to do. Intensity, again, really it's the same as any other muscle group. As long as you're getting within 1 to 3 reps shy of failure, you're going to get, most of the benefits you're looking to get from each set. Again, having at least one knee flexion exercise and one hip extension exercise at one point throughout the week is going to be your best bet to have your best hamstring development possible. And then finally, again, it's a reiterated point, but spending most, but not all of your time doing that longer muscle length training, because there does seem to be something special about that. So with that said, that's all the stuff I have for this video. So I hope you find that somewhat helpful, interesting, or something in between. I appreciate you being here, and I will see you next time.